Hello, I'm Jake Wallace-Simons. Welcome to Let's Talk America, a podcast from the Jewish Chronicle, in which I'm joined by Josh Kraushaar, the editor-in-chief of Jewish Insider in the United States, to explore the race for the White House through a Jewish lens. Today, Josh joins me from Milwaukee, where he's attending the Republican National Convention. So, Josh, welcome, and what's it like so far?
The proceedings wrapped up last night. I'm sure you
Right.
probably saw some of the highlights of former President Donald Trump's speech last night. It was the longest convention speech in at least modern American history, clocking over 90 minutes. And look, it was a tale of two speeches. I mean, I think the most significant part of the speech was when he talked for the first time about what happened just less than a week ago in Pennsylvania, where he was shot in the ear by a bullet, and he gave essentially the play-by-play to a rapt audience of thousands of delegates here in Milwaukee. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. I mean, it really connected, and it really has changed that whole. It's hard to believe it's been less than a week since that seismic event took place, but it really allowed the convention to put a more human spin on Donald Trump. Before he spoke, we had a couple days of a lot of speakers from his family members to other folks who worked for him testifying to the softer, gentler side of Donald Trump. And it was a more subdued former president talking about what happened. He said it's the only time he's ever going to talk about it. And then there was the rest of the speech, which was about another hour or more, where it was classic Donald Trump, also subdued, but it was rambling. It was filled with grievances, and it didn't have a whole lot of emphasis on what he's going to be doing if he's elected to a second term. So a lot of Democrats I talked to in the aftermath of that speech said, look, we were worried, we're panicked about, we can talk more about where the Democrats are right now, but the Democratic Party is a party in chaos. They're losing in the polls. Donald Trump put on a very effective convention, but then the old Donald Trump reemerged at the end of the night. The speech went on past midnight Eastern time here in the United States, and there were a lot of grievances, the same old grievances that we hear so often from the former president, and it was ad-libbed off the teleprompter in a way that I don't think was helpful for him politically.
Right. I saw that he was berating crazy Nancy Pelosi and coming up with some of the old favorites that are familiar to us from the last time he was in office. But I think from a Jewish point of view, there were a couple of moments that stood out. There was a bit at the end where he talked about the hostages, which seemed to really raise the mood in the room, and that's not something we hear from President Biden very often.
Yeah, it's a very important point. I mean, interestingly enough, Trump was basically giving like a rally speech, but it was without the energy and the excitement in the room for much of it. The one of the few lines that really did draw a whole lot of attention and engagement in the room was when Donald Trump called for the American hostages being held by Hamas to be returned. And that was a theme, by the way, Jake, of a lot of other Republican speakers, from Mike Pompeo, Nikki Haley, the theme, and then the Nutra family, who spoke at an earlier night at the convention. But Donald Trump said to the entire world, I tell you this, we want our hostages back. And it got a loud, rapturous applause in the room. And it's another data point, another example, Jake, about how strongly supportive of Israel and how different the Republican Party is these days from the Democratic Party when it comes to their views on Israel and Middle East policy.
Right, and he actually said, if I've got the quote here, he said that he was talking directly to Hamas. He said, "You'd better watch out. If I'm back in office, you'll be paying a heavy price unless they get the hostages back." And of course, I think 8 of the hostages are actually American citizens. It's really bizarre that President Biden doesn't seem to engage with that at all. He seems to be more preoccupied with berating Israel and criticizing it rather than actually standing up for the American hostages that are held in Gaza.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, look, it depends on what speed. I mean, President Biden has had I was at an event a little over a month ago for Jewish Heritage Month where he had one prominent hostage family at the White House. He has brought the plight of the hostages up. It's really that and there's certain moments where he's giving a speech, or I think most recently, he spoke at the NATO summit, and seemed to focus much more on what he called conservative Israeli war government or Israeli war cabinet, rather than mentioning what Hamas, you know, but rather than mention the terrorism of Hamas or talking about the plight of the hostages.
Yeah.
So, I mean, look, Jake, I think the challenges Biden is facing about his mental acuity and his ability to drive a message and just do the types of campaigning that you would expect a major party nominee to be doing. I think that relates to sort of his rhetoric on Israel. I don't think some of the lines or some of the mistakes he's made, I think, stem as much from confusion or not being focused,
Right.
and not having a well-oiled machine, frankly, as it does about the Biden administration policy, which has been, look, they've been trying to negotiate for the release of hostages. I don't know if it's always been effective, but they certainly have put the plight of the hostages on the policy side of things at the top of their agenda.
Right. I mean, but back to Trump. I mean, something else that really stood out from Trump's speech was that he thanked Ivanka Trump and, of course, Jared Kushner, who have recently sort of had some distance from Trump, haven't they? Do you think that if Trump wins, we can expect another role in government for Jared Kushner as an advisor or something else?
I think it's more important to look at who spoke at this convention compared to 2016 and who got primetime speaking roles at this convention. Don Jr. and Eric Trump on Thursday night. Don Jr. has a markedly different worldview than Jared Kushner on many issues. In fact, the debate about isolationism versus American engagement in the world was seen on center stage, and I know we'll be talking a little more about that. But Don Jr. Was one of his father's biggest advocates for picking J.D. Vance, the senator from Ohio, who's now Donald Trump's running mate. He's been outspoken about embracing a less engaged American posture in the world. And I think we did see Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner last night. We didn't see them earlier in the week, and you didn't have a speaking role for Ivanka Trump. So proximity is often a sign of power or a sign of influence, and my sense is that, not that they won't have any influence, but this is Don Jr.'s moment. This is someone who's been involved more and more in this campaign, and I think there's a lot of concern, frankly, in some circles, that the more isolationist view of a Don Jr. may take center stage more than the more internationalist view of a Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump.
Right. I mean, so let's talk about J.D. Vance then. You've mentioned him. I mean, he is an arch isolationist, but he has been quite outspoken about American support for Israel, particularly in May when he spoke to the Quincy Institute. He laid out his reasons for supporting Israel, and he managed to combine isolationism with support for Israel, at least in the immediate term.
That's right, Jake. We covered his speech at Jewish Insider, and we said he put a pro-Israel spin on a America First worldview. Look, J.D. Vance has a solidly pro-Israel voting record in the Senate. He has been an ally to the Jewish community and the pro-Israel community in Ohio in his time in office. But he also, number one, he's also raised some concerns from certain elements in the pro-Israel community because he is the leading advocate in the Senate of a unalloyed isolationism. He calls it America First. In fact, when we used isolationism in one headline, they don't want to call it isolationism. They want to really focus politically on spending more time at home, focusing on the opioid crisis, border security, issues that are frustrating Americans at home, and they don't want to see an active American engagement overseas. And J.D. Vance spoke at the bipartisan isolationist organization, think tank, the Quincy Institute, when he gave this speech about a month ago, notably calling for support for Israel, but also doing it in an organization that has some of the most hostile anti-Israel scholars, or if you call them scholars, I guess,
Right.
but anti-Israel thinkers in Washington. So there's a lot of concern. Look, I don't think it's because of J.D. Vance's personal views. I think everyone would acknowledge that he is a strong supporter of Israel. But the question is, when you bring in sort of this worldview into the government in a big way, you have your vice president. If he gets elected, Trump gets elected, you have a vice president advocating this worldview. Down the road, And if the view in America is that we shouldn't really focus on helping our allies overseas or spending money overseas, or if there's a crisis, to be as engaged as we've been in the past, that has implications for Israel, and we don't know how that's going to play out in the future.
Right. So, I mean, can you walk us through how JD Vance manages to match isolationism, which is not engaging overseas, with support for Israel, which requires some significant engagement overseas? How does he manage to mix those two things together?
Well, look, he's written and said Israel and Ukraine are not the same. He's made the argument, and I wish I had his speech in front of me right now, but he's been on the record saying that they're totally different situations. He said in the Quincy speech he admires the Ukrainians, but he doesn't think we should support them and give American money towards them. I think he said on numerous occasions that he likes the fact that Israel can defend itself. In fact, a lot of Americans or a lot of allies of Israel who have actually called for less of a U.S. They think sometimes the U.S. gets too involved and micromanages the government, as in the case of the Biden administration. And I think the Vance view is that let Israel do its own job, let it take out Hamas. We're not going to we don't have any troops on the ground, U.S. troops on the ground, and that's consistent with this worldview of not being involved. Support our allies, but not provide money or excessive or any military troops, American military troops on the ground. So, yeah, that's sort of how he squares the circle. He does it from a sort of a being able to support yourself type of attitude, and that's an argument that he's made publicly on numerous occasions.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed to me that in the Quincy speech, there were 2 points. One was that it's in America's self-interest to have engagement with Israel because Israel is a world leader in tech and has these, the sort of amazing military advances that America can benefit from. But at the same time, he wants to support Israel to beat Hamas so that Israel can make peace alliances with the Saudi regimes around it, and then America can withdraw and allow them to defend themselves against Iran. It was something along those lines. I mean, it's something that George Bush has been very critical of, George W. Bush, of this isolationism, which has been a characteristic, really, of the growing Trump doctrine.
Well, look, and what Vance laid out with the Abraham Accords and alliances, it involves active American engagement. I mean, that does not mean you withdraw from the region, or you withdraw from spending American capital and trying to reach a deal with the Saudis. So, like, there is a little bit. I think there's a little bit of ideological inconsistency. Like,
Right.
And look, I think there's a lot of questions. People say things and then they have to govern.
Right.
And I think that's the big test with J.D. Vance. We
Right.
don't have a long track record either. He's been in the Senate for only two years, less than 2 years. He's 39 years old. This is not someone who's been. And by the way, Jake, I mean, this is one of the things that also probably concerns some folks in the pro-Israel community. And he's evolved pretty considerably. When he first was in political life, public life, he was very hawkish and had a very, very different view on foreign policy. And as he saw Trump, well, he was also very anti-Trump. I had called Trump Hitler at one point in 2016 when he was the Republican candidate. I believe he was the nominee at that point. So, I mean, there is a little flexibility, and there's been an evolution in J.D. Vance's views on foreign policy.
Right, and as they say, you campaign in poetry and govern in prose. And one bit of campaigning poetry that stands out was from February when J.D. Vance appeared at the Tzedek Association, which is a Haredi organization. And he gave a speech to a room full of Haredim, and he was sung on by the bell singer Shulam Lima. So clearly, J.D. Vance has got a lot of friendship and warmth towards the Jewish community.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's never been a question about his close relationship with. I mean, Ohio is one of the largest Jewish communities, the state of Ohio in the country, in the United States. And he's always had. I mean, we interviewed some of the leading Jewish rabbis and officials in the state of Ohio who have nothing but good things to say about J.D. Vance, even when they disagree with him on an issue or two. There's been a good relationship there. That said, Ohio also has one of the largest. I think it has the largest Ukrainian American population in the country, and he has been very outspoken against supporting Ukraine in its defense against Russia.
And
so, I mean, usually politics is. I mean, Israel has widespread support, certainly among Republicans, but even across the whole country, and that's what's allowed there to be such a strong U.S.-Israel relationship. when you put like such a hardened ideology into the mix, and we've already seen sort of J.D. Vance ignore constituents that are Ukrainian constituents of his. Again, I'm not saying that he's not doesn't have these good relationships. I just think that there's a lot of there's a little bit of concern based on the ideology that's the America First ideology that he embraces.
I mean, you mentioned Mike Pompeo speaking at the convention, and he at one point accused Joe Biden and Kamala Harris of, quote, appeasing pro-Hamas radicals on our streets. Is that a message that you think resonates with Middle America, with most Americans? That sense that Biden and Harris are soft on the Gaza demonstrations?
Yeah, yes. In fact, I've said for a while that while Americans don't pay attention, well, I should say most Americans don't pay attention to the ins and outs of foreign policy. They do. Many of them send their kids to college. Many of them instinctively look at pro-terrorist slogans being waved and shouted in major cities and college campuses. And my goodness, I mean that there's been a long history in modern politics of a backlash to the kind of hard left activism within the Democratic Party, going back to 1968. This is sort of an echo of that. And I think when we saw college campus after college campus being taken over by anti-American, anti-Semitic, anti-Israel protesters, and some of the most heinous rhetoric being espoused. I mean, I think the images and the notion that we've got the country's getting out of control, or college campuses are getting out of control. This has been a theme of, frankly, of Donald Trump's for a while, and a lot of the people around him, that the education system is radical and teaching all kinds of anti-American ideologies and woke ideologies. I think that has larger purchase. You heard Shabbos Kestenbaum, who's a Harvard student who has been harassed, and we've reported on just these egregious incidents at Harvard, and that was a big moment at the convention on Wednesday night, and they also got quite a big focus by the delegates in attendance. So yeah, I actually think I think it's easy for Americans not to follow what's going on in Gaza like you and I do, and not to it's easy to just kind of almost get lost in the chaos and the details if you're just not following. I mean, most Americans aren't following foreign policy very closely. But I think the images and the sense of this radical left taking hold on college campuses is something that angers not just conservatives, but a whole silent majority of voters in America.
Right, and one thing that often people in Britain aren't aware of is that in America, 80% of voters support Israel, regardless. I mean, that's been quite steady since the beginning of the war until the present. That's not the case here in Britain and in Europe, and I think that that sort of message about the college campuses and the radicalism is going to play well with the majority of the American electorate.
That's right. The demography is also a little bit, quite a bit different in the U.S. I mean, even though there are pockets of Muslim of the Muslim vote in states like Michigan, like Dearborn, Michigan, the percentage overall is much smaller than in England and other European capitals, which has a big impact on politics. I mean, I think the biggest fear and worry in these states is that there's been this alliance between sort of the Islamist extremism and the very far left, progressive left. So it's really like the young progressives on campus have kind of, as you know, Jake, have sort of glammed onto this radical cause, this anti-Israel activism, but it's not the number. You don't have many constituencies in the states that have an anti-Israel perspective, or you don't have many districts in this country that have very significant Muslim populations.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about the Democrats. Joe Biden, suffering from COVID as we speak, has never looked less likely to be the candidate, although he might cling on. If he is replaced, there is a possibility that we may see a Jewish either presidential candidate, or more likely a vice presidential candidate, in the form of Josh Shapiro. Tell me about Josh Shapiro. I think most of our viewers and listeners probably won't have heard of him.
Yeah, well, I mean, boy, the Democratic Party is literally, as we speak, in chaos, where you have essentially a coup taking place. President Biden really has the ultimate say in whether he stays on the ballot and stays as the nominee. We haven't really ever had a situation in American history where we're this late into the process and there's a push to remove the nominee from the ballot, from the ticket. That's prompted a lot of speculation here about who could replace him. Vice President Kamala Harris seemingly is the most logical choice under that scenario. That he's obviously his vice president. She would inherit our organization, the money. It would be a more seamless transition. But if Vice President Harris ended up ascending to the top spot on the ticket, she would need a running mate of her own, and that's where Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, comes in. All the talk and frankly the political logic would dictate that someone who's more progressive and someone who's more tied to the progressive communities in the states in the party would want someone who's more would want a running mate, I should say, who's more moderate, who's you have an African American woman paired with perhaps a more moderate governor, and so there are a lot of names being floated. Josh Shapiro is one of the most popular politicians in America. His job approval rating in Pennsylvania, which, by the way, Jake, is probably the most important swing state on the map, is upwards of 60%. Republicans like him. In fact, our the Senate nominee in the state of Pennsylvania for the Republicans, recently posted a picture of him and Josh Shapiro trying to kind of get some of his support translated, perhaps shows bipartisanship and win over some of the support that Josh Shapiro has. Look, Shapiro, I think, is a testament to being outspoken against anti-Semitism, being proudly Jewish, and being a strong supporter of Israel. Why that hasn't hurt him at all politically, and I think a lot of the rhetoric in the Democratic Party often doesn't match the reality of where the voters are. Shapiro is probably one of the most popular governors in America. He was outspoken in calling for the resignation of the University of Pennsylvania president after that hearing about what she wasn't doing to fight anti-Semitism on her campus. He was outspoken on that front, and he has been a leader in visiting businesses that have been affected by anti-Semitism and vandalism. And he is not. There's been no price. He's as popular as ever. Democrats overwhelmingly support him, and he's being talked about as a very, very appealing running mate if Kamala Harris does end up moving into that top spot.
Right, and he famously put out an ad showing him celebrating Shabbat. So he's very openly observant, not just Jewish. But his popularity.
Yeah, he's a graduate. He went to Jewish day schools. He talks about his. I mean, he's very in the American way. He talks about his own Jewish faith as an example of the importance of faith generally, of religion generally, which is something that Democrats, frankly, have a problem with. And I remember in 2000, Joe Lieberman. People were worried. I mean, there was a lot of anxiety in the Jewish community that Joe Lieberman is openly Jewish. He's of Shabbat. How are non-Jewish Americans going to really react to this? It's going to lead to anti-Semitism. Never happened. Didn't happen. And if anything, he was a huge asset to Al Gore on that ticket. The same thing I am hearing right now to be fair, anti-Semitism has spiked quite a bit since 2000. We're at a pretty historic high in terms of anti-Semitic incidents in the United States. But Shapiro is as popular as ever, and I think it's a reminder that these are small extremes within even the Democratic Party. This is not the anti-Israel sentiment, the anti-Semitic craziness that's taking place on college campuses and elsewhere. It is a tiny faction that gets outsized attention.
And it's interesting, isn't it, that Josh Shapiro, in addition to being popular, as you said, on both sides of the aisle, he's really a unifying figure. After the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, he went to Pittsburgh, didn't he, and showed his support for Trump, and he gave a moving tribute to Corey Compratore, the man who was sadly killed in that attempt, and was praised by the Republican side. So he really is this unifying figure that seems like quite a bright prospect for the future of America.
Yeah, his instincts are moderate. He's a Democrat. He's not conservative, but he is from the what I would call like the Bill Clinton wing of the Democratic Party, the old school side of the party that believes that you have to be mainstream and you have to kind of work from the middle. And yeah, I mean the comments he made a day, I believe, after the assassination attempt on Donald Trump's life was a moving tribute to the Butler County firefighter who was killed, and talking about how he was a girl dad, how he was a devoted father, how he loved Donald Trump and supported Donald Trump and going to his campaign rallies. It was a moving moment. Joe Biden tried to say the same thing the next day. But it shows you just look at that split screen between what Josh Shapiro said on Sunday and what Joe Biden had said on Monday, and you see the difference in political talent right there. It's not that their messages were really that different, but the fact that Josh Shapiro had the compassion and the empathy shows you how much talent he has politically speaking.
And where does Josh Shapiro stand on Israel? I know the Democrats have, a big divergence of opinion on Israel.
Yeah, well, so he's a governor, so it's not like we have a long voting. I mean, there a lot of times, especially at Jewish Insider, we'll keep track of legislators' votes on where they stand on a lot of these hot button issues. But he's unapologetically pro-Israel. I mean, his public statements, his public life. I mean, there's been, he's not been trying to be like Bernie Sanders, or he is. I think anyone who's worked with him or talked to him or knows Josh Shapiro knows that he has a very, very deep connection to the state of Israel and the Jewish people.
Now, Josh, you obviously are very in touch with the pulse of the Jewish community in the States. If you were to summarize where the center of gravity of the community is, I know it's very diverse, but if you can place a center of gravity, how fond or how optimistic do you think that the community is towards Donald Trump, and what's its feelings about Biden? I mean, where do you think the community's center of gravity is in this election right now?
Yeah, so just like within the broader electorate, the level of observance or religiosity maps closely to your political preferences. So Orthodox Jews are now, frankly, I believe, like the latest data suggests, they lean Republican, lean towards Donald Trump, but more liberal Jews, which make up the vast majority of the Jewish population in the States, are Democrats, still pretty overwhelmingly Democratic. I think really the U.S. is the only Western democracy, the only diaspora where the Jewish vote has actually remained left of center rather than to the right of center. Though I think in England, I guess it was a little more divided, perhaps in the most recent British elections. But what's changed since October 7th is the sense that a large swath of the progressive movement, the left, has turned hostile to Israel, largely anti-Semitic in certain spaces. And as we've seen with the Biden administration, which is, I think most people would say is largely pro-Israel, even though there are disputes over what they're saying at a given moment or their policies at a given time. But there's been this need to pander to this very hostile anti-Israel faction within the party, represented by the Squad and AOC, Rashida Tlaib. I mean, they only make up about, less than 10 lawmakers among over 200 in the House, but they have an outsized voice and outsized impact. And there's this need, it seems, in the Democratic Party to constantly pander to those lawmakers and to that faction. So what we're seeing in American politics is not so much, my sense of things is not so much a widespread movement from Joe Biden to Donald Trump. I think Trump won 30% of the Jewish vote, which was a pretty solid number historically for a Republican in the 2020 election. There's been a few polls showing him in the 20s right now, even after October 7th. What we're seeing in America is not so much a movement from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, but a movement within the Democratic Party to supporting pro-Israel Democrats. Right. Because after all, that is where most Jews identify as Democrats. Most Jews, even before October 7th, didn't connect with the Republican Party under much more moderate candidates or much more traditional candidates like a Mitt Romney or John McCain. But we have seen Jamal Bowman, one of the most anti-Israel left-wing lawmakers, lose decisively in a Democratic seat, a heavily Democratic constituency in New York. We're seeing evidence that in Missouri, another one of the Squad members, Cori Bush, who we've been reporting on a lot here at Jewish Insider, one poll showed her down 20 points, or about 20 points in a Democratic primary among Democratic voters in the city of St. Louis and that area. So the fight is taking place within the Democratic Party. I would be surprised if you see a major shift towards Donald Trump. Donald Trump particularly is not someone who people would the kind of center left centrist Jewish voters whose votes are up for grabs. I don't think they'd be voting for Donald Trump, but they will be if they're in a district where you have an anti-Israel lawmaker, or if you're in a Senate race, perhaps, where you have a pro-Israel Republican candidate, there may be movement on the down-ballot side of things, and you certainly see the battles within the Democratic Party.
Right, yeah, I think that moment at the convention where Hulk Hogan ripped his shirt off and ranted about Trump mania was perhaps the least Jewish thing I've ever seen.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, this is the. I mean, there's nothing inherently like problematic about populism, right? I mean, that's what we saw at the Republican convention, a shift from the Republican Party being the. And you see, this is the same thing, you see this in England. I mean, it's the same
Yeah.
dynamic where the working classes, the blue collar folks in this country are railing against the elites, railing against big business. This is the Republican Party used to long be the party of the Chamber of Commerce, the sort of the business party. That is now we had the head of one of the leading unions in this country speak in the primetime slot on Monday night, railing against big business. That's something I never would have expected to see at a Republican convention in my lifetime.
Yeah.
So I think, understandably, this rise, whenever there's been a rise in populism historically, Jews tend to be a little worried because often they can be scapegoats for a lot of the problems that the majority view is, and I think that's what worries a lot of. I don't want to say a lot, but I think that's always on the mind of a lot of Jewish voters.
Right.
Look, we haven't seen. I mean, that it was a very pro-Israel. The talk about anti-Semitism, also was just very, very encouraging and very heartwarming, frankly, to see so many people who don't have skin in the game necessarily speaking out and cheering or cheering against fighting anti-Semitism, as we saw on that stage. So I actually don't think a lot of the worries are legitimate. But there is, whenever you see populism and hear about populism historically, there's understandable concern, and we saw a very populist very populist messaging from that Republican convention.
So let's look ahead to next week. We've got a visit from Benjamin Netanyahu coming up, who's coming to talk to Congress on Wednesday. We might talk about that in the next episode. Tell me about that, what it means, what people are saying about it, what it means on both sides of the aisle, and what's going on, what are the expectations ahead of Wednesday?
Yeah, well, it's quite a moment, look, President Biden has COVID, so one of the questions we've been trying to dig into is whether he's going to have the scheduled meeting with the president based on, I guess, COVID protocols and how his health is next week. The other big question is we don't know where the Democratic race is going to look like, what it's going to look like next week. There's talk. I think it's gotten ahead of reality, but there's been talk that Joe Biden could step aside from the presidential race as soon as this weekend, which would put a lot of interest or a lot of attention on Kamala Harris. And I think the question is whether the prime minister would meet with her as well if that was the case. So there's a lot of uncertainty along sort of what's happening with our administration, and then you also have the reaction he's going to get, and a thoroughly
Huge
nonpartisan
protests.
figure. Say again.
Huge protests, I imagine.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting. I would imagine too, though. I will say that I expected protests here in Milwaukee. I did not see hardly
Right.
a single protester, and
Oh,
I
really?
think, and my own theory, and we'll see what happens when Prime Minister Netanyahu visits, but Israel and the Middle East and the war were front and center in the American news for every day since October 7th. For the last 2 or 3 weeks, since politics has certainly reasserted itself, it's not on the news at all in the United States. So I think a lot of that, the protests and the craziness was a reflection of what people were seeing on their screens, not so much their knowledge about what was going on, as we know. So I'm interested to see. I mean, obviously Netanyahu's visit will put the U.S.-Israel relationship once again at center stage. But I wonder how much of a protest movement we will see. I do think the bigger issue, though, Jake, is the reaction from certain Democrats in Congress. And we know what when President Herzog, a nonpartisan figure, spoke recently after October 7th, there were Democrats that still boycotted his speech, showing that this is not about Netanyahu. It's a lot deeper than that. It's a lot more, frankly, sinister than that from these very hard left Democrats. And now you're hearing, some of these squad members or rumors from the far left that they want to do something to disrupt the speech. Speaker Johnson, Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, said he's essentially going to use the force of the Capitol Police, the force of law, if that happens, to maintain decorum when Prime Minister Netanyahu speaks next week. So that's the other big question: whether you'd have squad members trying to have a show of disruption on Capitol Hill during the speech.
Right. I mean, sometimes I feel that the criticism of Netanyahu is so vituperative and so filled with hatred. It feels like he is a sort of symbol for sanitized anti-Semitism in the same way as sometimes people use the word Zionist instead of Jew. Sometimes they use the word Netanyahu instead of Jew, and they can get away with the same stuff.
Yeah, yeah. It is obvious that there's a lot of overlap. We all know this, Jake. The notion that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitic. I mean, intellectually maybe, but the reality on the ground has been obviously the opposite.
Yeah. So, what else do Jewish viewers and listeners need to know about American politics right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, the big question, as we've discussed, is who is the Democratic nominee for president going to be? And one of the things we're watching at Jewish Insider is we're getting closer to the Chicago convention in August, where the Democrats will. We expected this to be a coronation for President Biden. Now it seems like we could have history in the making, where you could have the nominee chosen on the floor. Instead of having an event where you tout all the accomplishments of the nominee, you could have a fight between all these different factions in real time in Chicago. So, vis-a-vis issues we care about when it comes to Democratic Party support for Israel or lack thereof, I mean, I think the worry is that if you kind of open things up, you kind of play a gamble and try to get a new nominee, it could expose some of the more left-wing elements of the Democratic Party. Now, the delegates that are in Chicago are more moderate because these are Biden delegates. These are much more heavily weighted towards the Biden wing of the party than we've seen in past conventions. So I think that comes perhaps as a relief to Democrats who look at past conventions, like in 2012, where discussions when Israel was discussed as part of the platform, they got booed famously. And then in 2016, it was the Bernie Sanders wing of the party was very outspoken. You could see that on the floor. But if we have this chaotic moment where we're figuring out what the ticket is and these debates are taking place in real time, I mean, I think there is a worry that the uncommitted vote, this was the essentially the anti-Israel vote that took place in primaries, and there's some delegates representing that cause, that they could have an outsized platform and perhaps they could push the party in a more leftward direction. So conventions are intended to be these days very neat, organized, well choreographed shows promoting the candidate. But if there's chaos, if we don't know who the nominee is, or if that's all being worked out, it could allow for the left to have more say and more power than typically would be the case.
Right. Well, hugely volatile time. Thank you very much for walking us through it, Josh. And I look forward to speaking to you next time for the next edition of the podcast.
Thanks, Jake.